This is globalpublicmedia.com, and I'm Julian Darley, interviewing petroleum geologist Dr. Colin Campbell at his home in Ballydehob, Ireland, on the 18th of December 2002. Are we running out of oil?
Well, yes, of course we are running out of oil, and we started doing that when we produced the first barrel. And when we will eventually run out of oil is a very difficult thing to estimate, and it's also almost irrelevant, because what really matters is not when we finally run out, which is a long way into the future, but when the production, which has been growing now for 150 years, reaches a peak and begins to decline. That, I think, will be some kind of historic discontinuity that will affect virtually all aspects of life, given that the world runs on oil. So that this is the subject we really have to address. Primarily, the issue of running out is very secondary to the importance of peak and decline.
What is the significance of peak oil?
Well, to try to explain peak better, the first point and I think we could all agree on this, that you have to find oil before you produce it. So the first peak to really concentrate upon is the discovery record. What is the record? What is the trend of discovery over the past? And if we look into the data, we will find that many of the largest fields in the world were found pretty early on. In Texas, for example, in the United States, the peak of discovery was in 1930, and that once the oil is found, of course, it takes some time to put it on production and to drill all the wells and everything. And so that was then followed, in the case of the United States, after 40 years, by the peak of production. And since discovery had peaked so long ago and has been declining despite every effort ever since, it follows that production must also decline, and there's really nothing to be done about that. Nothing is black and white in this subject, because we also have to consider carefully what we're really measuring and what we're talking about, because there are many different types of oil. Obviously, there's a huge difference between a Middle East well flowing at 50,000 barrels a day and digging up a tar sand in Canada with a shovel. So what we really have to do is identify, and very carefully, all these different categories and see what their endowment in nature is, what their costs and characteristics are, what their depletion profiles are. For example, whereas a Middle East well will rise rapidly to a peak or a plateau and then decline as it approaches exhaustion, a tar sand in Canada is produced extremely slowly, and you can go on producing that for forever and a day, gradually increasing production very likely in the future as the need arises. But it's a very different, it's more like a mining operation than conventional oil.
How does oil discovery relate to depletion?
Well, I mean, the first discovery of oil in modern times anyway was, oil has been known from antiquity. The construction of Babylon used oil as a kind of mortar, so it's been known from the beginning of time, but the modern industry really has its roots in the middle of the 19th century, about 1859, and you might just look at the evolution of the discovery patterns in the world. It started, one of the earliest places was the Caspian, but that was soon overtaken by Pennsylvania in the United States. And it's interesting to think about Pennsylvania a little bit, because as this new oil, which was replacing whale oil at that time, used for lighting, which itself changed the way people lived in a way, adding an evening to a working day, and whale oil was getting depleted by overfishing. So suddenly they found this rock oil, as it was called, in Pennsylvania, and the first well was drilled to a depth of 67 feet, more or less, very shallow well, and immediately a boom took place. Everybody and his brother rushed in there, and there was a great surge of activity, and then, as always happens, before long, this flood of new oil depressed the price. And so you go from boom to bust. And then in the early days we had to try to control this pattern of depletion, which really reflects the nature of oil in the ground in a way. It comes flowing out of the well in a great surge at no effort. It's not like digging it up with a shovel. And so Rockefeller, in the end of the 19th century, tried to bring a sense of control to this. He tried to match the market against the supply, controlled the railroads, and brought a kind of sense of order to the thing. Of course, he was much reviled. He was perceived to be establishing a monopoly to his own benefit, and there's no doubt he did benefit from it. And the independent producers hated him with a passion and so on. And eventually in 1911, the Rockefeller empire was broken up by antitrust legislation in the States. But then exploration moved around the world. Venezuela, in fact Peru, Latin America was brought in, and attention started turning to the Middle East. That's a very interesting story itself. The origins of Middle East oil really go back to the Germans wished to build a railroad from Berlin to Baghdad for certain military and political reasons, and they got a concession from the Ottoman Sultan to do so. And the engineers surveying the track of this railroad found oil seepages close to Mosul in northern Iraq, as it now is. And as a result of that, the Sultan had this man Gulbenkian investigate these occurrences, and simultaneously with that, the Iranians became aware of this development and sought to develop Iranian oil. And in 1906, the first oil was found in Iran by a British consortium of people. And it began to be evident really quite early on that these countries around the Middle East had an enormous endowment of oil. And then in the United States, after the boom and bust and all these events, interest shifted to Texas, where a well came in I think it was 1902, Spindletop near Beaumont. And this opened another such surge, and oil companies Texaco and Gulf Oil were created out of this sudden great surge of oil. And then the United States again found that this overabundance of production that inevitably follows an early find was dropping the price and causing all kinds of problems. And so the famous Alfalfa Bill Murray, I think he was the governor of Oklahoma, sent in the militia or somebody to shut down the oil wells to protect the price. So out of that arose the Texas Railroad Commission that controlled the supply and the production and price of oil in the United States. And so it goes on in a repetitive kind of way, and then later the international oil companies did basically the same thing throughout the world. And finally we have OPEC, who tries really quite valiantly, one must say, to keep a sense of order in the way in which this stuff is produced, and they're greatly vilified for their efforts. They're regarded as the enemies of the West and holding the world to ransom and all of these kind of expressions. But actually they're doing as well as they can, and not very well either, a needed job to keep a sense of order in the way in which depletion is managed.